All right, class, let's go ahead and talk about worldview. Worldview is really important when we are talking about history because it impacts the way we see the world, and more so than that impacts of how we see history and how history operates in our lives. Each of us comes in with this very unique worldview, and it's going to be pretty much different for every single person out there of how the world looks to them based upon life experiences. But let's go ahead and kind of explore that concept and show it how it can impact your view when you're studying history or when you're picking out perhaps a topic in our courses. Okay, so a couple great quotes here looking over worldview. You can say the view of the world and the resulting way of life with it, or a comprehensive framework in one's basic belief about things. One of the ones I really love is the one here at the bottom corner. A vision of God, the universe, our world, and ourselves, rooted and grounded in the embodiment of human heart as a seat and source of our worship, spiritually, ideas, beliefs, loves, and affections, decisions, and actions. Because that's a pretty complex way to look at the world, and it's a pretty deep way to look at it. But I've always found that one really fascinating. That's why I like to include it. But let's give you probably an easier definition of what a worldview is. The concept of worldview refers to an interpretation of reality that provides an overarching framework for the constitution of the world or the cosmos. Various belief systems, religious ideologies, and science itself are examples of worldview that contain differing pictures of the world. So, that was a lot. But the thing is when we look at it, it's showing you that there's a lot of complexity into trying to understand one's worldview because there are so many factors that impact it. And therefore, it can make it very complicated to try to pull apart your worldview in order for you to see that you see the world through a lens, through a biased lens. And that biased lens is not necessarily a bad thing for you, but at the same time, it can color how you view people, events, actions, systems. I mean, everything when we go and look at a worldview. We'll get a little bit more into that here in a few minutes when we talk about like personal worldview between us. Okay, this is the easiest way I can break down a worldview for somebody to try to understand it. It's what is reality to your person. Okay, that means, as much as I would love to be able to, at any given point, to step into somebody else's shoe and see exactly how the world operates according to them, I can't. And they can't do the same thing to me because no two people ever have the exact same lives that they've lived. And so therefore, everybody's going to see it in a little bit of a different way, okay? And you need to be cognizant of this. You need to be aware of this too. When you're thinking about things, if you're looking at the world itself, you have to be aware that your life experiences, your upbringing, your belief systems, they all impact how you see everything else around you. And you may not be aware of it. You may think everybody else thinks exactly like you. And I hate to say it, not probably anybody thinks just like you. We all think different ways about different things. And quite often we keep it pretty personal and in our minds. So, but check those. Why do I say that? Because the best way to understand somebody else is to take away your bias and ask them some questions. Ask them about who they are, what their upbringing was. Those little things that are going to be able to open those doorways so that you can see that people are all a little different and they view the world differently, not perhaps because of an ideology, but maybe their upbringing or how their parents were, or jobs they've had, or a host of other things that could impact that, okay? Another thing is your worldview is also how you see yourself. When you actually look in a mirror, who are you? And everything you've gone through in life, again, that's going to shape your worldview. If somebody said to you your entire life that you're a horrible, awful human being, you might sit there and think, I'm a horrible, awful human being. But if your parents were loving and kind and coddled you and were there every minute and every day and talk to you about how great you were. You might have a very positive self-image of yourself, and therefore your ideas of bias or underlying hatred of something or systems or something along those lines may not be there, okay? Overall, what is it? It's how you look at the world and how you act in the world. That's what your worldview is going to be. Your interaction with the world itself is going to shape your worldview too, because if you act a particular way towards people, they are going to act a particular way to you in return, and therefore that is going to impact how you perceive things. What do I mean by this? Okay, so for example, you say, I hate restaurants. Every time I go to a restaurant, I get really terrible services. Everybody's mean to me. I just hate the experience day in, day out every time I go there. And you go to a restaurant with a bunch of friends, and they witness you, and you are demeaning, angry. You send everything back 5 times. You complain at the wait staff that they're slow all the time, and you're just rude. And suddenly everybody goes, maybe it's not the restaurant. Maybe it's you. But that's what I mean. If you are interacting the world in a particular way, you're going to get a certain result in return, okay? So just kind of understand that when you're trying to look at why somebody's acting the way they are, or why they're acting that way towards you in particular. So what other factors can impact your worldview? Well, age. Of course, I mean, all of us are of different ages. I'm probably substantially older than most of you. I've probably almost been 2 lifetimes over you now. So my age really impacts how I see the world. I'll go over that in just a moment here. Your ethnicity, I mean, we all know that is something that we all look at in the world and how that can impact it. For example, I'm, as you can kind of tell, I'm a white guy. My wife is from Peru, and we have very different ideas of how to do things such as Christmas. So there is a lot of cultural conflict at times in our home as to how we do Christmas. It's not something people would think about, but there is definitive differences of how we both were brought up, and the environments we were brought up, and the countries we were brought up of, to how we interact and do things during Christmas. Of course, your sex, man, woman, it's going to be, something's going to happen there that people are going to treat you a certain way, and it's going to impact how you see the world. I mean, we all know that there's a different lens between them. Okay, your family structure, do you come from a big family, a small family? Do you come from a single parent home? Were you adopted? All those different little aspects really change how you view the world. A lot of that is because of economic conditions. So going directly to the next one, if you tend to come from a 2-parent household, more than likely you probably had a little bit more money than other groups, and you're probably at a bit higher socioeconomic bracket, okay? That does make a big difference, family structures. Your language will impact it too. One of the things that my wife complains about all the time, I like using her a lot, so I apologize, but she's a very intelligent woman. She has a bachelor's degree. She's gone to school. She's graduated from 2 universities, actually one in Peru also, but because her English is not a 100% American and it has an accent, she feels like people treat her less and act like she's less intelligent than she is, when in fact she's very smart. She just has an accent, and so that happens to people. I try to go to Peru, and my Spanish is absolutely horrible, and so I get very self-conscious when I'm down in Peru, and I don't talk to anybody, so people think that I'm probably angry all the time. That's what my wife tells me anyways. Everybody thinks I'm mad, and I'm not. I'm just shy and embarrassed, so because my Spanish is not great. Education is, the more you've been exposed to education, typically the more you know. Therefore, you may have a greater grasp and concept of the world around you. You may have been exposed to a classical education where it was heavy in arts, and you have a deep literary background. So if you're watching something like a TV show or movie, you can see the storylines or understand how they were crafted. Religion, that was one of the biggest things. Either you are or you're not religious, or you were raised in a certain religion. Even if you have left that religion, some of those religious ideas and teachings still impact how you see the world in general, okay? And then lastly, where you live. I mean, trust me, life is pretty different from in Utah compared to Florida. So I'm from Utah, if you guys didn't watch the intro or read my introduction. But living in Florida is a wildly different experience for me. Same thing as I moved from Iowa when I was about 15, and that was wildly different from living in Utah. So that has impacted how I've been raised and how I've grown up. So I grew up in a small town of about 1,200 people. I moved to Utah and I went to a junior high of 1,200 people. So the junior high was as big as the town that I had left. And so, yeah, that did impact me and how I saw things, okay? So let's kind of break down the differences between you and me. Not always the same, but this works out a little bit better in a classroom environment, okay? I'm 40. During my lifetime, I have witnessed the Challenger blow up on TV, watched it live when I was in kindergarten. I watched the Berlin Wall fall, so I saw the fall of communism. I saw the reshaping of Russia. I lived through 2 major wars in the Gulf, Middle East. I also lived through September 11th, which it has dynamically shifted how I perceive and see the world. Also, I served in the Air Force, so I was deployed overseas right after September 11th, and I spent time in Kuwait and Afghanistan. So, has my worldview been shaped differently from probably somebody your age? More significantly, yes. You probably are aware of 9/11, but I still remember watching the planes hit the buildings, and I to this day have a hard time even revisiting and watching them again. So, I mean, there's a lot of people my age group, especially those who are in New York City areas, that have pretty severe PTSD from that day. So, you should understand that people will see the world a little bit different from you, okay? So that's just kind of some slight differences and examples of kind of how I saw the world comparative to maybe how you see the world. All right. So here's the main reasons why we're going to look at this, okay? History in and of itself is impacted by people's biases and worldview. It really is. Historians of the past write history different from historians of the present day. You have, like, for example, if you look at the Civil War, there's an entire section of history written about the Civil War where it's very pro-South, and it is seen as that they engaged in a cause that was noble, okay? And we look at the Civil War in modern times, and we're like, it was a war for states' rights. And then, as one of my favorite co-workers always said, states' rights to do what? Then, of course, states' rights to have slavery. And so we look at the Civil War from a whole different lens of this wasn't some justified war, but in fact, it was a war over if people can own other people. Okay, so that's one reason why we look at it. And so when you're studying history and you're going back and you may be reading older history books, which I do own a number of really old history books. I think my oldest one that I have in my library behind me is about 120 years old, and it gives me a pretty unique viewpoint and picture of how the French and Indian War was presented in the past. And so I just absolutely love reading the difference of viewpoints, okay? So you need to understand that if you're researching for your papers or a video and you come across an older document, that you need to understand its generation that it was written in and their worldview of how they perceive things, okay? Now, one thing that as a historian you should always try to do is be neutral. You should not take sides. And I know that sounds interesting. I mean, because somebody's going to say to me, well, what if I'm studying Nazis? I shouldn't take a side. Well, I mean, we all know that Nazism is bad, and what happened with the Nazis is probably one of the worst things that's happened in human history, aside from like mass genocide through other groups like the Soviets and the Chinese, okay? We understand that. Now, when we're talking about not taking a side, that means that you are becoming a detached historian that's looking at facts, okay? That simply means you're studying Nazism, but you're not sitting there going, well, I'm going to write this entire thing just with my level of disgust about these people. And again, that's really hard to put a bias aside, okay? That's a pretty extreme example. For the most part, as a historian, you don't have to make huge decisions like that. My studies often, they go, once again, to the French and Indian War, so I have to say, which side am I more likely to encounter? Is it English accounts or is it French accounts? Because they're going to be wildly different from each other. As a historian, you take a neutral approach and you look at both sides and you come to what the facts were. So if I'm studying a battle, I may just try to figure out what the movements were, who was attacking who, how did the battle end up, how many people lived, how many people died. So you become somewhat detached through there, okay? Another thing is how do you determine if a historian is biased? Because they are. I mean, be honest with you, all historians are biased. I'm biased. I try not to be, but I try to be a neutral third party, but there is bias behind everything I do. Remember, we're talking about worldview here. Okay? One way to look at it is, if you're reading a history book, everybody writes a foreword to their book. More often than not, their foreword is going to tell you what you're going to find in the book, what information they included, what information they excluded, okay? And more often than not, you can read an author's bias pretty quickly in those opening sections, okay? All right, so anytime you take like a U.S. history course, you're going to get from a different professor, you're going to get a different perspective. It's just how it is. We all see history different. We all understand it differently. We've all studied it differently. That's a big thing about it, is we've all studied it differently. We all have our little pet areas that we really love to study and that we know a lot about. And then we know a lot about a little. So, I mean, like when we're talking about huge generalities, all right? So understand that as a historian, try not to look through things with a single worldview. Try to shake it up a little bit and understand what you're looking at, okay? All right, so what are some of the major ones that you would see in U.S. history? You have American exceptionalism. You have often nationalism. You have American imperialism. So American exceptionalism is like, rah, rah, USA, everything's A-okay. Nationalism is very proud of our culture and our ancestry and who we are. American imperialism is the United States went out and conquered a whole bunch of people and killed a bunch of people, and so therefore it's terrible. Marxism is there's always a class struggle going on somewhere. Liberalism, they tend to focus on progressive ideas and actions that are happening throughout society. Globalists, they tend to try to put history into an entire sphere. Lots of this you'll see in modern historical learning. They move to like Atlantic history, where they study the entire rim of the Atlantic to learn about early colonialism when it comes to Europeans. That's more of a globalist perspective of it. And there's just too many for me to go over because they legitimately are tons out there, okay? All right, so why should you learn it? We're just going to review this really quickly. It impacts how you read history. It impacts your politics. It really does. How you were raised. As you get older, your politics change. Trust me, it happens. It impacts how you see right and wrong. That's a big one. Your worldview shifts how you think what is good in the world and what is bad in the world. I mean, if you grew up in abject poverty and your parents had to steal just to feed you, you may not think that theft is wrong, and I could understand why. I mean, if you were hungry all the time and that was the only way to get through, that might be just how you were raised. And again, people need to look through the perspective of worldview, okay? If you continue on with your worldview, this can impact if you stay in a certain religion or a certain faith. Your worldview, again, how you were raised and things that impact your life will always impact your family structures too. If you come from a home with two parents, if you come from a single home, once again, you come from adoption, those all can really shape how your family structure will eventually be, okay? And once again, it's going to impact the world around you. So one last thing that I want to cover real fast, and I know it's a little bit long. What is my goal as a U.S. history teacher for you? Well, first and foremost, I want to teach you U.S. history. I want you to have a broad understanding, at least, of some of the key and core concepts of the United States. That way you can interact in the world and be able to do so in a way that makes you look smart. That's one thing that people always talk about, is if you know history and you understand things that people are talking about in a room when it comes to history, you look like one of the smart people in the room. If you don't know anything, you'll end up on one of those YouTube videos of where they ask people questions about history and they can't answer them. And you don't want to be that person, okay? I will try to tell you anytime I'm using a worldview if it impacts what I'm teaching, okay? I don't color my history with a sphere of political ideology. I do my best to avoid it. Now, like I said, does everybody have implicit bias? Yes, they do. But I do my best to check it at the door and not bring it into the classroom, okay? I will also let you know about my bias if it is something there. So, for example, again, going back to like 9/11, I have an implicit bias because I witnessed it. I was in the military when it happened, and so it definitely colored and changed my view of what happened to my country at that time. Okay, so does that impact sometimes how I present 9/11? Yes, it does. Have I gotten better over it? Yes, I have. Okay, so that would be an example of where I would have to check my bias at the door. Okay, lastly, history. It's not clean, guys. It's old. It's been around. People have had a lot of ideas. People have thought a lot of things about a lot of people that we now know in our modern view is not correct. However, sometimes we're going to have to use language of the era, okay? Sometimes I'm going to use the words like Indians, and I know people aren't going to be happy with them, but we're using generational terms. Do Indians call themselves Indians? Yes, they do. When we talk about AIM, it's the American Indian Movement, okay? And this is a group made up of Native Americans who are doing things. Sometimes because of language, and I've been reading of the era, I might call African Americans blacks. That happens, okay? I try to avoid using the terms, but they are going to happen just because based upon what we're talking about and the literature itself around there, okay? So try not to hold that against me if I'm using something. Trust me, I'm not going to use any big, evil, bad words. It's not coming out, okay? I'm smarter than that. All right, but this is, I really promise you to try to give you the most unbiased view of history that I possibly can so that you understand how we got to where we're at. And when people talk about maybe traditionalism or the founding or how structures of government work, all those certain things, that you can kind of start to get into that groove. I would highly recommend, if possible, that you take an early American history course too, okay? That will give you a better view over the growth and the establishment of the country. I know you guys have to take a civics class. I'm really excited for that because I always want people to be very civic-minded and very engaged in American politics. I'm not telling you to vote one way or another, just be engaged, okay? You make me proud. All right, that's going to cover Worldview for now. We're going to have other videos too with lectures. I'll try to make them much shorter than this and try to make them short and sweet, but I can't always promise, okay? All right, I'll see you guys later.